I discovered at 52 that the woman who raised me saying she had saved me from the trash actually kidnapped me from my real family and spent 5 decades making me feel grateful for a rescue that never existed. The DNA test was in my hands, trembling like leaves in the wind of a storm that hadn't even started yet when the 50-year-old truth collapsed upon me like a building in controlled demolition, but without prior warning. 0% genetic compatibility with the woman I called mother throughout my entire existence. The one who always threw in my face having saved me from the trash when we were children playing on the dusty street of the poor neighborhood. When I asked for something we couldn't afford and my child's eyes didn't understand financial limitations, when I dared disagree with her about anything no matter how small, I picked you up from the trash, ungrateful girl. You should be thankful every day instead of complaining about the food, the clothes, the life, she would say with that harsh voice that still echoes in my nightmares like a bell in an abandoned church ringing alone in the wind. But the medical paper in my hands that September afternoon, which began normal and ended with my life in ruins, showed no divine salvation or act of Christian charity. It showed premeditated and calculated kidnapping. It showed that my entire life had been built upon the cruelest crime someone can commit against a mother, stealing her baby and raising it as their own, transforming true maternal love into sick possession disguised as sacrifice. And the clinical words from the laboratory danced before my eyes like venomous snakes, forming sentences that I read and reread, hoping they would change. That they would reveal a typing error, a laboratory mistake, anything but the naked truth that I was the victim of a crime that lasted my entire life. I had done the test out of medical curiosity, mixed with concern about genetic predispositions for diseases I saw Donna Celia developing with age. Roberto, my personal doctor, who I later discovered in a revelation that would be comical if it weren't tragic to be my biological brother, whom fate had placed in my path as a presage, had suggested after noticing inconsistent genetic characteristics during routine examinations he had been doing for 3 years. Some things don't match with the family history you gave me, the blood type. Some genetic markers, small inconsistencies that may mean there is incorrect information in your history, he said professionally without knowing he was about to detonate a nuclear bomb in my existence, transforming atoms of certainty into an explosion of doubts. The private laboratory in the city center had air conditioning that was too cold, making me shiver since I entered. Or perhaps it was my blood that had frozen upon reading those clinical and definitive words that transformed 5 decades of memories into elaborate lies, 5 decades of identity into emotional fraud, 5 decades of filial love into Stockholm Syndrome elaborated over enough time to seem real. And the receptionist asked if I was okay when she saw me pale as paper holding the envelope as if it were a death sentence, which in a way it was. Death of who I thought I was, forced birth of truth I didn't ask to know. Donna Celia was sitting in the worn-out armchair in the living room that creaked under her weight whenever she moved, watching the 6 o'clock soap opera as she had religiously done for 40 years without ever missing an episode. Completely oblivious to the paper I held in my sweaty hands like a death sentence for our relationship fabricated with lies and cemented with emotional manipulation. The small, stuffy apartment smelled of reheated coffee and cheap disinfectant, a combination I had always associated with home, but that now physically sickened me. Each familiar object suddenly strange like the crime scene it had always been, but I didn't know. "Mother," I said, and the word burned my throat like sulfuric acid slowly descending, corroding vocal cords that had pronounced this word thousands of times in 5 decades, but now sounded like blasphemy. "We need to talk about something very serious, something that will change everything between us." She barely took her eyes off the television where the male lead of the soap opera was swearing eternal love to the female lead in a ridiculously melodramatic scene, accustomed to ignoring me as she always did when something wasn't about her. Her back problems that worsened with age but that she used as emotional currency. Her back pains that conveniently appeared when she needed help but disappeared when she wanted to go out. Her endless complaints about how life had been unfair to her since birth. Ironic to the point of Greek tragedy, considering what was about to be revealed and how she had been unfair to someone else's life. I turned off the television with the remote control that trembled in my right hand, while my left held the examination as if it were an anchor to reality. And I saw her face contort into that expression of contained anger mixed with indignation that I had known so well since childhood, the one that usually preceded some comment about ingratitude that cut deep, about how she had sacrificed her whole life to raise me without ever receiving adequate recognition. about the damn trash from which she claimed to have rescued me as if she were the heroine of a distorted fairy tale, and not a calculating criminal who destroyed multiple lives out of selfishness disguised as maternal love. What is this, Mariana? Can't you see I'm watching my sacred soap opera? After everything I've done for you for 50 years, I can't even have peace to watch television in my own house? The emotional manipulation, as automatic as breathing, as natural as blinking for her after decades of practice. But this time I had nuclear ammunition to counter 5 decades of psychological abuse disguised as sacrificial maternal love. 5 decades of elaborate lies like a spider's web, where I had been a trapped fly since infancy. I placed the exam on the scratched coffee table stained with coffee with the surreal calmness of someone in shock, too deep to show appropriate emotion. Watching as she picked up the paper with poorly disguised irritation and abrupt movements that showed how much I had bothered her by interrupting the sacred soap opera, her arthritic fingers trembling slightly not from age, but perhaps from a premonition of what was to come. I saw the exact moment when she understood what she was reading through the reading glasses she insisted she didn't need, but without which she couldn't see anything. The blood drained from her wrinkled face like water through a clogged drain that suddenly opens, leaving her with a grayish tone that frightened me by filial instinct that 50 years don't instantly erase. Her hands began to tremble violently, as if she had sudden Parkinson's, the paper making earthquake noise between her fingers. And for the first time in 50 years of accumulated memories, I saw genuine fear in those eyes that had always been hard as stone, cold as winter, calculating as a computer programmed for manipulation. Where did you get this? Who gave you permission to do this? How dare you investigate my life, our life? She asked with a strangled voice that seemed to come from a deep well of finely discovered guilt, confirming with the visceral and uncontrolled reaction what the scientific paper stated with laboratory coldness. She had always known, every second of every minute of every hour of every day for 50 years, that I was not her biological daughter, that she had committed a heinous crime and lived with it as if it were a distorted medal of honor. The question is not where I got it, I replied with a calmness that both surprised and frightened me simultaneously, as if another person was speaking through me, perhaps Beatrice wanting to be born from Mariana's ashes. The question is, who are my real parents? Where are they? What happened to them? And what exactly did you do 50 years ago that requires a DNA test to discover? Who am I really? The silence that followed was dense as melted lead, heavy as the decades of lies that hung between us like finally visible ghosts, suffocating like a pillow pressed against a face for too long, but not enough to kill. Only to torture with lack of air that was a perfect metaphor for our relationship. She tried several times to start speaking, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, slowly dying in silent agony, dry lips forming words that wouldn't come out, until finally the version she had told for half a century came out automatic, like a worn recording, rehearsed in front of the mirror for decades for moments of questioning that perhaps she always knew would come. I saved you. You were in a dumpster behind the municipal market, abandoned like garbage itself, approximately 3 months old, crying until hoarse, soiled with your own feces and urine, starving to the point of not having the strength to cry loudly. I caught you when everyone walked past pretending not to hear. I took you home in my tired arms after a workday, washed you with my own hands, fed you with milk I bought with the last money of the month, raised you as my own daughter when I could have left you to die like a rat in the garbage where they threw you. But there was something different this time in the way she told the rehearsed story, the transparent desperation of someone who knows the lie doesn't stick anymore because scientific evidence is irrefutable, the poorly disguised panic of a criminal cornered by their own trap, cold sweat running down her forehead, despite the suffocating heat of the apartment without air conditioning, hands gripping the armchair until her knuckles turned white like exposed bones. If you found me in the trash as an abandoned baby needing salvation, why did you never legally register me with the proper authorities? Why are all my documents irregular with inconsistencies that any competent clerk would notice? With dates that don't match? A hospital that doesn't exist? A doctor who never existed? I had spent the last few weeks obsessively investigating like an amateur detective, discovering inconsistencies that had always been there, screaming truths I didn't want to see, evidence I ignored out of love, fear, or denial. Why did we move cities 3 times before I turned 5, always in a hurry, always leaving everything behind like fugitives? Why don't I have any baby pictures before age 2? No clothes kept with a mother's care, no baby shoes, nothing from before age 2 that every mother keeps as treasure? Why did you always change the subject when I asked about my birth? About first words, first steps, first baby food? The questions came out like bullets from an automatic machine gun, each one hitting the target with surgical precision trained by years of repressed resentment, each unanswered question being a confession by omission. She rose abruptly with agility that belied her age and constant complaints of pain, pointing her finger in my direction like a medieval lance, as she always did when wanting to intimidate me until I shrank, made myself small as an ant, reminded me of my place as an eternal debtor of life and infinite gratitude. You are a miserable ingrate. I gave my entire life for you without asking for anything in return. I worked like a slave in Madame's house to give you food that I often didn't eat myself, clothes that I didn't have, education that I didn't get. I cleaned rich people's bathrooms, scrubbed floors until my hands bled, endured daily humiliation. And this is how you thank me after half a century? Investigating my life as if I were a criminal? Doubting me as if I were a liar? The argument quickly escalated like fire in dry brush. Decades of accumulated resentment exploding like a dam broken by impossible to contain pressure. Muddy water of repressed emotions flooding the small apartment with untold truths and exposed lies. I shouted questions that echoed on the thin walls. She shouted accusations that ricocheted off the low ceiling. The neighbors probably heard everything through the paper. Thin walls of the modest apartment where we always lived because people like us don't need luxury, according to her. When in reality, it was to maintain the low profile of a fugitive. It was when she said something that changed everything, words that escaped in the heat of the argument like steam from an exploding pressure cooker. Your real mother didn't deserve you anyway. Rich, stuck-up woman, with employees doing everything, barely looked at you between parties and social commitments. Left you with just anyone while she went out to be a socialite. I gave you true love of a real mother, not of a madame who outsources motherhood. The exact moment the words left her mouth like verbal vomit impossible to take back, she realized the fatal mistake that decades of care couldn't prevent in a moment of desperation. She had admitted to personally knowing my real mother, had confessed she didn't find me anonymously in the garbage, had revealed she stole me from someone specific she knew, observed, envied. The silence that followed was deafening like a nuclear explosion that first blinds, and only then does the sound arrive. Devastating like a tsunami that pulls back the sea before destroying the coast. Definitive like a dying person's last breath. You kidnapped me, I said, and the words came out like divine revelation and infernal condemnation simultaneously, truth that always existed but only now manifested in words. You stole me from my real family, deprived me of my true identity, and spent 50 years making me feel grateful for it through emotional manipulation and psychological abuse. Donna Celia collapsed in the armchair like an imploded building, aging 10 years in 10 seconds like Dorian Gray's portrait in accelerated speed. The mask of suffering and sacrificed mother that she wore for 5 decades as armor finally fell shattered to the ground, revealing the desperate and criminal woman underneath, small and pathetic in her humanity, distorted by envy and desire. I just wanted a child, she whispered in a broken voice I had never heard before. And for the first time, her voice had no calculated manipulation, only raw and painful truth like an exposed wound. Joaquim and I tried for hellish years of hope every month followed by disappointment, tears hidden in the bathroom, but it wouldn't come no matter how much we prayed, no matter what promises we made to the saints. I had been working in her house for 2 years. Your real mother, Helena Torres, saw her pregnant, beautiful and radiant while I bled every month, took care of you since you were born premature but perfect, 3 kilos of perfection that she barely held because her madame's cesarean stitches hurt. She had everything money could buy. Handsome businessman husband who adored her, house with pool and garden, maids for everything. And she still had you, beautiful as a porcelain doll, healthy despite being premature, perfect in every detail. I had nothing but the burning desire to be a mother, dry womb that couldn't generate life, marriage to a good but absent man, life as a servant that would never be more than that. The confession continued pouring out like pus from an infected wound that was finally opened after decades of fermenting, rotten words of stored guilt mixed with justifications rehearsed on sleepless nights. It was their wedding anniversary party, 5 years. She left wearing a red dress that cost more than I earned in 6 months. Left you with the teenage relief nanny who fell asleep on the couch after drinking in secret. I was working overtime that they wouldn't even pay properly, cleaning the kitchen after the party, washing crystal glasses worth more than my life. I went upstairs to use the service bathroom and passed by your room, Open door, you in the imported crib sleeping like the angel you were, and something in me broke like crystal on the floor. It wasn't planned at that moment, but perhaps it had always been planned in my subconscious. I took you wrapped in the pink blanket, went down the service stairs, left through the back gate knowing the code, and simply walked to the bus station with you in my arms. That simple and that complex. I changed cities that dawn, told drunk Joaquim I had adopted an abandoned baby. He never questioned much. I think deep down he knew something was wrong but preferred not to know. Complicit by omission until he died of cirrhosis. My world was spinning off its axis like a planet ripped from orbit as she spoke, each word rewriting 5 decades of personal history in real time. Memories being recontextualized like a movie watched backwards, revealing a plot twist that was always there. My real mother, Helena Torres. Is she alive? I asked with a voice choked by tears that I didn't know if they were from anger, sadness, or relief. Thick tears falling uncontrollably, carrying cheap mascara that I always used out of economy. Dona Celia nodded, defeated like a general surrendering an army, head down for the first time in 50 years of fabricated pride. Helena Torres, yes. Textile business entrepreneur, now retired but still rich. Lives in the capital in the same upscale neighborhood. Never stopped looking for you, from what I know through news that I obsessively followed out of fear and morbid curiosity. She offered millionaire rewards, hired international detectives, appeared on television every year on the anniversary of your disappearance in the early years, crying and begging for information. But I had changed everything about you. Your name, age, history, everything. You were Beatriz Torres, born in March 1973. Became Mariana Silva, born in July of the same year. 4 months and a different name, documents falsified by a corrupt clerk, were enough to make you disappear from the map as if you had never existed. The clinical coldness with which she described the crime was frightening, like a living autopsy, as if she were reporting a complex cake recipe, and not the premeditated kidnapping of an innocent baby and destruction of an entire family. And you never felt remorse in 50 years? Never thought about her devastating suffering as a mother? About the father searching, the destroyed family? Dona Celia looked at me with those hard eyes I had known all my life but now saw differently. Not hardness from a difficult life, but from a heart turned to stone by crime. Remorse for what? I gave you an honest life, even if poor. It may not have been rich in money, but it was honest in love in my way. I worked every day of my life to support you with dignity. She was rich, had other children afterward. From what I heard, she had another soon after you disappeared. Roberto, his name. I only had you. My stolen but loved miracle. The police arrived 3 hours after my trembling phone call. Summoned by me while Dona Celia still sat paralyzed in the armchair like a pillar of salt, aged and defeated but still trying to justify the unjustifiable with the distorted logic of someone who had spent decades convincing herself that crime was an act of love. Detective Santos, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much human tragedy to be surprised but still maintained compassion, listened to the confession with unwavering professionalism, while her team searched the small apartment with latex gloves looking for evidence of a crime from 5 decades ago that probably no longer existed physically, but was metaphorically everywhere. Mrs. Mariana, or should I say Beatrice, she told me with a gentle but firm voice while Dona Celia was handcuffed, a scene I never imagined witnessing even in my darkest nightmares, the woman who raised me being arrested for loving me too wrongly. We'll need to do more complete DNA tests with official chain of custody, investigate old records in multiple cities, but if the story is confirmed as it seems it will be, your biological family needs to be notified immediately. Prepare yourself emotionally because this will be a tsunami of emotions for everyone involved. Seeing Dona Celia being taken by the police was surreal, like a lucid dream where you know you're dreaming but can't wake up. The woman who raised me with severity and distorted love, who fed me even while going hungry herself, who dressed me in thrift shop clothes but kept them clean, who attended school meetings pretending to be a proud mother, who took care of me when I was sick with dengue at 15 nearly dying, but also the woman who stole me from my true family like an object in a store, who deprived me of a completely different life with opportunities I never knew existed, who built 5 decades of elaborate lies like a house of cards and made me feel grateful for it through constant emotional manipulation. The following weeks were a surreal blur of invasive exams, exhaustive testimonies repeated until memorized, parallel investigations that discovered layers of lies like an infinite onion. The story went viral in national media. Woman discovers at 50 she was kidnapped as a baby. Kidnapper raised her claiming she saved her from the trash. And my private life became a public spectacle consumed by millions who had opinions about trauma they hadn't lived, judged pain they hadn't felt. Reporters camped outside the hotel where I hid, microphones shoved in my face when I tried to buy bread, requests for exclusive interviews with obscene money offers for my suffering. But none of that mattered. It was white noise compared to the moment I met Helena Torres, my biological mother who had searched for a daughter for 50 years without ever giving up. It was in a neutral office at the police station, with beige walls and the smell of old coffee, with Detective Santos present as a mediator trained in impossible meetings. When she walked in, time stopped and accelerated simultaneously. It was like looking at myself in a mirror aged with elegance instead of poverty. The same brown eyes but without the wrinkles of financial worry. The same face shape but cared for with expensive creams. Even the way of walking was similar, but with the confidence of someone who never had to apologize for existing. She stopped at the door as if she couldn't believe I was real, as if 50 years of searching had been a mirage in the desert and she was afraid I would disappear if she blinked, looking at me with an intensity that pierced the soul. "Beatrice?" she said with a voice that was both whisper and scream, and the name I'd never known sounded strange and right at the same time, like a word in a forgotten language whose meaning you suddenly remember. They told me. The DNA confirmed with 99.9%. You are my Beatrice, my stolen baby. The embrace that followed was desperate, like a castaway clutching a lifeline. 50 years of longing compressed into a gesture that broke emotional ribs of both. She smelled of expensive perfume I could never afford. I smelled of cheap hotel soap. But our bodies fit together like a puzzle separated by decades finally complete. She cried violently, wetting my shoulder. I cried silently, wetting hers. Even Detective Santos discreetly wiped away a tear, pretending it was dust. Humanity breaking through professionalism. I never stopped looking, Helena whispered against my graying hair that she caressed as if it were gold. Never. Not a single day in 18,000 days. I hired detectives from 5 countries, went on all missing persons programs until they banned me for being repetitive, hacked systems, bribed officials, kept your room exactly as it was the day you disappeared, waiting for you to come back, waiting to hear you crying in the crib again. The guilt I felt was overwhelming, like an avalanche on a mountain of remorse. There was a woman who suffered for 5 decades looking for a daughter who was alive just 300 kilometers away, raised by the very maid she had trusted as family. "Roberto is coming," she said between sobs, moving away to look at me better, but keeping her hands on my shoulders as if I would evaporate, touching my face with trembling fingers, as if to confirm I was real and not just another cruel dream. "Your brother whom you never met. He was born 2 years after you. Disappeared emergency seat. Section, because I wouldn't stop crying. He dedicated his adult life to looking for you too. Became a neurologist. Said it was a way to help people and understand the human mind since he couldn't help find you or understand how someone steals a baby. When Roberto entered 15 minutes later, the connection was immediate and disconcerting, like déjà vu in reverse. The doctor who had been my personal physician for the last 3 years without either of us knowing, who had suggested the DNA test due to genetic inconsistencies that his trained eye noticed, was my biological brother whom fate had placed in my path like a piece of cosmic puzzle. "I suspected deeply but not consciously," he admitted with a choked voice, tears running down his normally professional face, transforming the doctor into brother. "Something about you always seemed familiar beyond coincidence. A feeling of knowing without ever having known, but I thought it was transference or genetic coincidence. When I saw your genetic characteristics in routine tests, the blood type that didn't match what you thought based on your parents, genetic markers indicating different ancestry, I suggested the test thinking perhaps you were adopted without knowing. I never imagined you would be my kidnapped sister. Never imagined fate could be so cruel and kind simultaneously. We discovered in the following days through obsessive investigation that fate had put us in the same path several times like a script written by a sadistic playwright. Roberto had moved to my city 5 years before, specifically to expand the search for me, including the countryside. Had given lectures on genetics and neuroscience at the school where I taught, and we probably crossed paths in the hallways. We had 3 mutual friends who always commented how alike we were. Must be relatives. But we never took it seriously because the surname Silva is too common, and the world is ironically small and large at the same time. The adaptation to the new reality was brutal and chaotic, like learning to walk after 5 decades in an emotional wheelchair. Discovering at 50 that your real name is completely different, that your birthday is wrong by 4 months, that your entire carefully constructed identity is fraudulent from the birth certificate on, is like drowning and being born burning at the same time. Simultaneous destruction and reconstruction without anesthesia. Helena showed me photos and videos of what would have been my life in albums organized by year that I never lived. The big house with a garden where I was born and stolen. The baby room decorated in pink and white tones that she kept intact for 5 decades as a sanctuary of sick hope. The photos of the 3 months I lived as Beatriz Torres before becoming Mariana Silva against my will or knowledge. Each image a parallel universe where I was happy without knowing. There were also videos in poor quality from old cameras, home recordings on VHS tapes that she had obsessively digitized, fearing to lose the last memories, showing a chubby and happy baby surrounded by luxury and love that I don't remember, a life that was stolen from me by jealousy and desperation of a dry womb. You had a Filipino nanny, 2 maids who took turns, a driver, everything the best money could buy. Helena recounted, trying to smile through perpetual tears. But Celia always seemed especially dedicated to you, more than the others. I trusted her completely because she had worked with us for 2 years before you were born, never showed anything but professionalism mixed with care that seemed genuine. Now I understand she was observing, planning, waiting for an opportunity. The betrayal was multiple, like sequential stabbings. Donna Celia had betrayed the trust of employers who treated her well, stolen a baby as if it were an object, and raised me in poverty while my real family had resources to give me a completely different life. Education that would open doors, opportunities I didn't even know existed. Donna Celia's trial was a media circus that lasted for hellish months, where every sordid detail was dissected by commentators who knew none of the people involved, but opined like experts. She was charged with aggravated kidnapping, forgery of public documents, use of forged documents, psychological mistreatment. The prosecution brilliantly argued that making me believe I was rescued from the garbage constituted severe emotional abuse with permanent psychological consequences, mental torture that lasted 5 decades. During the trial that I attended every day as a necessary form of torture, sordid details emerged like bodies in a drained lake. Mr. Joachim, whom I called father until his death from cirrhosis 10 years ago, apparently knew or strongly suspected the kidnapping, but chose cowardly, complicit silence, drinking his guilt until his liver gave up in protest. Old neighbors were summoned and testified about the sudden, always nocturnal moves, about how Donna Celia appeared with a baby out of nowhere one April morning, about the contradictory stories she told about my origin depending on who asked, and how much she had drunk. An elderly neighbor of 87 reported with impressive memory. She first said she had legally adopted, then that I was an orphaned niece, then that she found me on the street, then that I was left at her door. People pretended to believe because it was easier, but everyone knew something was very wrong. Babies don't just appear out of nowhere. The feeling of having lived 5 decades surrounded by people who suspected the truth but chose complicit silence out of convenience was almost as painful as the kidnapping itself, collective betrayal by omission. Donna Celia was sentenced to 12 years in prison in initially closed regime, a sentence that many considered too lenient for 5 decades of continuing crime. But advanced age and health problems were mitigating factors that saved her from a greater sentence. On the day of the sentence that seemed like a soap opera finale but was my real life, she looked at me from the defendant's bench with eyes that showed no real remorse, only self-pity, and said loud enough for everyone to hear and the media to record, "I loved you in my twisted way." It may not have been legally right, but it was emotionally true love. I left the court without answering because what response could exist for that? How to respond to crime justified by love? She loved me, yes, in a sick, possessive, toxic way that left permanent marks. She raised me with rigid discipline, educated me with traditional values, gave me moral foundation, ironically taught me about honesty while living the biggest possible lie, about gratitude while robbing me of the right to choose. The complexity of feelings I have for her is something that my psychologist, Dr. Letitia, says I will take years or decades to process, if I ever process it completely. You can hate the crime and still have conflicting feelings for the criminal. She explains in the weekly sessions that are essential for my already fragile sanity, using technical terms that I try to understand while my heart refuses to accept. She was your mother for 50 years, even though she shouldn't have been. The brain doesn't turn off 5 decades of emotional connection just because we discovered it was based on crime. Neurotransmitters don't distinguish true love from Stockholm Syndrome after so long. Helena tried to compensate for 5 lost decades at an impossible record speed, surrounding me with well-intentioned, suffocating love that, although understandable after so much suffering, was difficult to process for someone raised with measured and conditional affection. She wanted to give me everything money could buy immediately: a new house in the upscale neighborhood, imported car I never dreamed of driving, trips to places I only saw in magazines, designer clothes that seemed like costumes, jewelry worth more than the apartment where I was raised, as if material gifts could buy back lost time, as if consumerism could heal trauma. "Mother," I said once during dinner at a French restaurant where I didn't know how to pronounce anything on the menu, and the word still sounds strange and forced for someone other than Dona Celia, like a foreign language I study but don't master. I don't need material things I don't know how to use. I need time to understand who I am now, to process these two conflicting identities. Because this is the most difficult and fundamental truth. At 52 years old, I no longer know who I am, suspended between two existences like a ghost of both. Mariana Silva was an elaborate fiction created by a kidnapper to cover up a crime, an identity built upon lies. Beatriz Torres is a stranger who exists only in yellowed documents and other people's memories. The ghost of a baby who never grew up. I am trapped between two identities like a split personality, neither completely real because one is a lie and the other is a temporal impossibility, neither completely false because I lived one and was born the other. Roberto has been a bridge between the two worlds that don't naturally connect. As a neurologist, he understands psychological trauma with scientific knowledge that helps rationalize the irrational. As a brother discovered late, he offers unconditional love that comes from shared DNA but without the weight of shared memories. We discovered surprising affinities despite 50 years separated like parallel universes. The same taste for Latin American literature that no one else in the family has. The same inexplicable aversion to horror films that causes us disproportionate anxiety. Even the same way of laughing, throwing our heads back that is genetic and not learned. Genetics is powerful, he jokes, trying to bring lightness to a situation that weighs emotional tons. You can separate siblings at birth and they will still like the same things. He tells me about growing up in the shadow of my disappearance like a plant trying to grow under a dead tree. About parents who never overcame the loss, transforming the house into a mausoleum of memories. About how Helena developed chronic depression, treated with prescription drugs and endless therapy. And how our father, who died 15 years ago still searching for me with private detectives until his last day, obsessively blamed himself for having gone out on the night of the kidnapping to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Our family was never the same afterward, Roberto confesses on a rainy afternoon while we have coffee. He with refined sugar and I with sweetener out of a poverty habit. Now I understand it wasn't just 3 people living with your disappearance. We were 4, you included, living lives devastated by the same crime in separate universes. The financial issue also had to be addressed with bomb-diffusing delicacy. Helena immediately wanted to include me in the will with impossible retroactivity, to give me the portion of the inheritance that would have been mine had I grown up as a Torres. But accepting money I hadn't earned seemed like charging for 5 decades of suffering, transforming trauma into a commodity. It's not charity or payment, Helena insisted with tears in her eyes during a meeting with lawyers who looked like well-dressed vultures. It's your birthright that was stolen. Celia stole this from you too, besides family. The financial stability that eliminates anxieties, the quality education that opens doors, the opportunities that money provides, the network of contacts that privilege creates. It's a painful truth that I lived a life of constant limitations where every cent mattered, where many choices were determined by lack of resources rather than genuine desire. I studied in a rundown public school where the ceiling collapsed and everything was lacking, attended a public university not by merit, but because it was the only free option, became a teacher not out of passion, but because it was an accessible career with the stability that poverty demands. What person would I have been with other opportunities? A doctor like Roberto? A businesswoman like Helena? An artist that poverty doesn't allow? It's a question without an answer that torments me during sleepless nights, when silence screams lost possibilities. The apartment where I lived with Dona Celia is empty now. Frozen in time like the emotional crime scene it always was, but that I only now recognize as such. The moisture-stained walls that I always saw as a mark of poverty now seem like petrified tears of 5 decades of lies. Each worn piece of furniture tells the story of a life that shouldn't have been mine but was. Each corner hides a memory that I don't know whether to preserve or destroy as evidence of a continuing crime. I can't sell it, because that would be admitting a definitive end. I can't go back to living there because it would be accepting a prison from which I was freed. I can't even enter to get my things, because each object is a trigger for trauma that I still don't fully know how to name. Roberto and Helena have offered multiple times to empty the place, hire a specialized company, spare me the physical confrontation with the past materialized in cheap furniture. But there is something about others handling the relics of my false life that seems like a final violation of privacy that no longer exists. Each object in that place tells a story that I now know to be a lie, but which was my truth for 5 decades. The photo album where I smile without knowing I'm kidnapped, with no images of me before age 2 because kidnapped babies don't have photo books. The diploma hanging on the wall with the false name I used to build my career. The collection of Mother's Day cards that I made with such care and creativity for the woman who stole me from my real mother. Dr. Letitia suggests that eventually I should go there for an exposure therapy session, physically confront the past to process it, but I still don't have the courage to face the ghosts that live in each room. It's easier to live in the antiseptic limbo of the hotel room paid for by Helena with money that I don't feel I deserve, suspended between 2 lives like a ghost who belongs to neither world, neither the living nor the dead, neither the rich nor the poor, neither the Torres nor the Silva families. The media won't leave me alone. Emotional vampires disguised as investigative journalists trying to suck every drop of suffering to transform into clickbait. The story is too sensational to ignore. Lower middle-class woman discovers she's an heiress kidnapped by a jealous maid. Kidnapper raised victim with cruel story of rescued from the trash for 5 decades. Dr. Brother was the one who inadvertently discovered the truth through a routine test. Wealthy biological mother never stopped searching. Reporters pursue me with the persistence of legalized stalkers wanting exclusives that would earn journalistic awards. Hollywood producers want to make documentaries exploring every sordid detail. Famous writers want the rights to the story for a guaranteed bestseller. It's blatant emotional vampirism disguised as public interest. Vultures circling a still-living corpse. Helena hired a team of expensive lawyers who seem like a legal mafia to protect me, secured restraining orders that are subtly violated, lawsuits for invasion of privacy that yield compensations I don't want, but still, they persist like plagues. I drastically changed my appearance, cut the hair I kept long for 5 decades because Donna Celia said a woman without long hair isn't a complete woman, dyed it blonde which doesn't suit me but disguises me, wear dark glasses even on cloudy days, avoid public places as if I had a contagious disease, live like a fugitive in the very city where I grew up. The irony doesn't escape even through the fog of trauma. Donna Celia made me live hidden for 50 years without me knowing I was a kidnapped person being searched for. Now I consciously live in hiding, fleeing from those who want to exploit my story. The most difficult thing to process psychologically is dealing with memories that insist on existing despite being based on a lie. Not all are bad. That's the problem that Dr. Letitia calls traumatic cognitive dissonance. There were moments of genuine joy that I don't know if they were genuine or performance. Birthdays celebrated with simple cornmeal cake, but made with what I thought was affection but now question if it was guilt. Christmases with few inexpensive gifts wrapped in newspaper but with human warmth that may have been the warmth of crime heating conscience. Hugs when I was sick with high fever that seemed real but came from criminal arms. How to reconcile this with the monstrous crime that originated everything? How to completely hate someone who, however wrong and criminal she was the only mother I knew for 5 decades, whose lap I sought when I had nightmares without knowing she was the nightmare? Dr. Letitia says I don't need to reconcile anything, that I can keep the contradictions coexisting like emotional quantum physics, that humans are too complex to fit in binary boxes of victim and villain, love and hate. But society wants clean narratives like Prime time soap operas, the innocent and pure victim, the cruel villain without nuance, the true loving family without defects. Reality is much messier, dirty, contradictory, impossible to package into a sellable narrative. I visited Donna Celia in prison once, 6 months after the conviction that the media covered like a Roman spectacle. Helena was horrified when I told her, tears of disbelief running down her well-cared. For face, Roberto worried about my already fragile mental health, but I needed answers that only she could give. Needed to look into the eyes of the woman who raised me and destroyed me simultaneously. The women's penitentiary was a 2-hour journey on a potholed road. A gray construction that looked like a concrete disease in the middle of nowhere, a place where women pay for crimes that society doesn't expect them to commit. She looked smaller, as if the discovered crime had physically shrunk her, older in years than months past, but still with that hard look I'd known my whole life, and now understood to be armor against her own guilt. The visiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with desperation. Other women visiting other criminals, all pretending normalcy in a fundamentally abnormal situation. Why the garbage? I asked without preamble or pleasantries, straight to the point that had hurt for 5 decades. Why spend 50 years humiliating me with this sadistic story? Why not invent a normal adoption? Abandonment at the doorstep? Anything less cruel? She looked at her own hands, now without rings due to prison regulations, for a long time before answering in a voice that seemed to come from a deep well of rehearsed justifications. Because if you believed you had been thrown away like garbage, you would never want to look for where you came from. The shame would be too strong. And if you felt grateful for being saved from certain death, you would never question anything. Gratitude would be a chain stronger than iron. It worked for 50 years, didn't it? The coldness of the calculation made me physically nauseated, rising vomit that I swallowed with difficulty. Each ungrateful I heard during 5 decades. Each time she reminded me of the supposed garbage in moments of vulnerability. Each public humiliation using fabricated origin was a conscious strategy of psychological control. Psychological warfare against a child and later an adult who didn't know she was in battle. You destroyed 4 main lives and countless peripheral ones through your selfishness disguised as love, I said, standing up to leave before weakness made me cry in front of her. Mine that was never mine. My real mother's who still looks for her daughter in every face on the street. My father's who died of a heart attack at 58 still looking for me with his last breath. My brothers who grew up in the shadow of my absence trying to be 2 children in one. Donna Celia grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for her age and circumstances, nails too long digging into my skin as she always did when she wanted to control me. And doesn't my life count? Do you think it was easy to live 50 years in fear of being discovered? Every knock on the door thinking it was the police? Every question about your past having to invent a new lie? Every document that needed falsifying risking prison? Every time you asked about baby photos having to invent excuses? I also lived in a prison, Mariana. Beatrice. Whoever you are now. A prison I built, but a prison nonetheless. I left without responding because there was no adequate response. But her words remained like splinters under the skin. She consciously chose that prison. I chose nothing. Neither to be born, nor to be stolen, nor to live a lie, nor to discover the truth. But now I have to live with the consequences of choices I didn't make. Helena organized a birthday party for me following rituals I don't recognize. My real birthday in March. Not the false July date I celebrated for 5 decades, thinking it marked my birth when it marked the approach of the crime. It was embarrassing and sweet at the same time, like a coming-of-age party for a 52-year-old woman, a desperate attempt to recover a lost ritual that cannot be recovered because time is the only resource money cannot buy back. The party was in the party room of the luxury building where Helena lives, decorated with flowers that cost more than my monthly teacher's salary. There was a 3-tiered cake with fondant that looked too much like an edible work of art to eat, metallic balloons floating on the ceiling like lost dreams, even a photo album of what would be my first 3 months of life before the kidnapping, each page a stab of life not lived. Roberto made a speech about second chances that aren't second, because the first was stolen. About family being more than blood but blood helping. About the statistical miracle of finding me after 5 decades that he calculated to be less likely than winning the lottery. I tried to smile for photos that don't represent me, thank for a party I don't feel is mine. Pretend it wasn't deeply disturbing to celebrate a birthday I don't recognize as mine, with a family I don't recognize as mine, despite DNA confirming it. The guests were strangers who were apparently cousins, uncles, people who cried over my disappearance as a baby and now didn't know how to act with my return as an elderly person. An aunt said with good but terrible intention, "You have your grandfather's nose." And I didn't even know I had a grandfather because he died looking for me, much less what his nose looked like or why mine being similar mattered now. Therapy with Dr. Letitia is the only place where I can be completely honest about the paralyzing ambivalence I feel, where I don't need to pretend gratitude for being found or anger for being stolen, where I can admit terrible truths without judgment. Sometimes I hate Helena for having had housekeepers. I admit with shame that burns more than words. If she hadn't hired Donna Celia to clean what she herself could clean, none of this would have happened. It's irrational, it's unfair, it's victim blaming, but I feel it anyway. It's irrational to the point of absurdity, unfair to the point of cruelty, but trauma doesn't follow Aristotelian logic, doesn't respect syllogisms. Other times I hate Roberto for discovering the truth through a test that could have waited. If he hadn't requested the DNA test, I would still be living my ignorant but stable life. Mariana Silva teaching Portuguese to uninterested teenagers without questioning reality. And always, constantly, obsessively, the question that won't be silenced even with therapy and medication. Would it have been better never to know? To live and die as Mariana Silva, grateful daughter of a heroic savior, than to discover I am Beatriz Torres, victim of a calculating kidnapper? Ignorance is not bliss, but knowledge of this specific truth seems like a curse without redemption. The process of legally changing identity is Kafkaesque to the point of seeming dystopian fiction. Technically, Mariana Silva never legally existed because all documents were falsified with amateur competence, forgeries good enough for everyday life, but that don't withstand official scrutiny. Beatriz Torres exists on an original birth certificate, but officially ceased to exist at 3 months of age when she was declared missing, presumed dead after years without clues. Creating a legal bridge between the two identities requires endless hearings where I have to prove the improbable, witnesses to confirm the impossible, piles of paperwork that try to give bureaucratic sense to a 5-decade crime that defies meaning. The judge in charge, a 60-year-old man who seemed to have seen everything, said with genuine amazement, "In 40 years of judiciary dealing with impossible cases, I've never seen a case that so defies legal logic. I need to prove I am myself, but which myself? The retired teacher everyone knows as Mariana Silva, but who technically never existed. Or the missing baby Beatriz Torres, whom nobody recognizes as an adult. It's a bureaucratic labyrinth where each solution creates 2 new problems. Each resolved document reveals 3 irregularities. Each step forward is 2 steps back. Helena insists on showing me what would have been my life through objects and places preserved like religious relics. Macabre tourism of an unlived existence. She took me to the private school where I would have studied if I hadn't been stolen, a historic building with manicured gardens where tuition costs more than Dona Celia earned in a year, to the private university where I already had a guaranteed place by surname before birth, to the club where the family has had a perpetual membership for 3 generations, and where I would have learned tennis and swimming instead of survival and resignation. It's tourism of an unlived life that leaves me emotionally exhausted to the point of collapse, each place a parallel universe where I was happy and fulfilled instead of kidnapped and limited. You would have loved the riding lessons, Helena says with desperate hope in her eyes, as if at 52 I would start horseback riding to make up for lost time, as if elite hobbies could fill a 5-decade hole. Roberto is more sensitive to the impossibility of the situation, understands with medical empathy that I cannot simply put on a life I never lived as if it were new clothes bought in a store. That identity isn't a coat you change. You are who you are, he tells me with professional and brotherly kindness, raised as you were raised with the values you have, experiences you lived. That doesn't retroactively change. It just adds context, however painful it may be. It's comforting and insufficient at the same time, like a band-aid on an amputation. The new apartment that Helena insists on paying for with money that seems tainted by guilt that isn't hers is beautiful, but not home. Never will be. Decorated with expensive furniture I didn't choose in a style I don't understand. In an upscale neighborhood I don't know where neighbors look at me with polite suspicion. It's the setting of a life I don't know how to live. A stage where I don't know my role. I keep a packed suitcase in the room without even consciously realizing it. Not from a conscious intention to flee, but from being unable to feel permanent anywhere, uprooted in a way a tree cannot survive. I am a refugee from my own existence, an existential stateless person with no country of origin to return to because the country of origin was a lie. The neighbors know me as Beatriz, a name I still don't respond to naturally after months of trying. When someone shouts Beatriz on the street, I don't automatically turn my head. 50 years of Pavlovian conditioning as Mariana don't disappear with DNA discoveries. Neurons don't reorganize just because truth appeared. I started writing a diary, trying to reconcile the 2 narratives of my life like a schizophrenic historian of my own existence. Each memory needs to be re-examined under the blinding new light of truth, like an archaeologist excavating her own past. The day Dona Celia taught me to ride a bicycle at 6, holding the seat until she let go without warning and I pedaled alone for the first time. Was it crime or care? Love or possession? My college graduation where she wept copiously with pride, tears that wet my diploma. A performance for an audience or genuine feeling from a mother, even if criminal. The belt beatings when I disobeyed or talked back, marks that lasted weeks. Normal discipline of the time or control from a kidnapper afraid of losing control over a growing victim? There are no simple answers. Black and white turned into an infinite scale of gray. Dr. Letitia says there may never be definitive answers, that living with extreme ambiguity is part of the human condition elevated to the extreme. But the ambiguity of my situation seems too extreme to fit into normal human experience. I am a statistical and emotional outlier. Roberto discovered through obsessive genetic investigation that I have predispositions for various hereditary conditions that Donna Celia could never have known about or prevented. Type 2 diabetes that's already manifesting. Hypertension I've been medicating for years without knowing the origin, elevated cardiac risk that would explain the palpitations I've always had. Tendency toward depression I always thought was circumstantial but is chemical. If you had been raised with access to a complete family medical history, you could have better prevented or controlled it from an early age. He explains clinically, trying to hide fraternal pain, but I see the pain behind the professionalism, the guilt of a doctor who couldn't prevent. One more thing stolen from me beyond the obvious: the right to my own true medical history, knowledge of my genetically inherited body, informed prevention. Now, at 52, I discover I should have taken preventive measures I didn't, because I didn't know I needed to. Specific exams I didn't do because I thought I had no family history. Lifestyle changes that could have been made decades ago if I had known the genetic truth. It's another layer of grief in an infinite onion of losses, for what could have been prevented if I hadn't been stolen. Nights are the worst, when darkness amplifies internal demons. Without the distraction of day, the two lives battle in my mind like armies in a civil war, where no winner is possible. I dream of Donna Celia calling me ungrateful in a voice that echoes in an empty cathedral. I wake up sweating, looking for Helena to comfort me, but Helena is a stranger who shares my DNA but not my memories. Insomnia is chronic now, medicated with prescription drugs but persistent like a criminal who always returns. At 3 a.m, a time I discovered is statistically when most people die. I wander through the apartment that doesn't feel like mine, like a ghost haunting the wrong life, looking at photos of a life I didn't live framed in silver, of people who are family by blood but seem like actors from a movie I didn't watch. The Italian bathroom mirror returns a face I now know is identical to Helena's when young from old photos, but which I always saw as unique, as mine, as Mariana's. Even my appearance doesn't completely belong to me. It's genetic inheritance from a family I didn't know, each feature a reminder of their loss and mine. I tried to return to teaching, to seek normality in the routine that defined me for 2 decades, but the school thought it better I retire on permanent psychological disability. It's for your good and the students, the principal said kindly but with poorly disguised relief in her eyes. You've been through unprecedented trauma. I had become an unwanted tragic celebrity, a walking distraction, a morbid curiosity parents didn't want near their children. Parents whispered at the gate about the kidnapped teacher. Students looked at me like a circus freak. Fellow teachers didn't know how to act. If they treated me normally, it was insensitive. If they treated me differently, it was discrimination. The early retirement was presented as a choice, but was a gentle expulsion. One more loss to add to the infinite list. My career built with a false name but genuine effort. My professional identity the only thing I built alone. My daily purpose that gave structure to existence. Now I spend endless days trying to figure out who I am when I'm not Professor Mariana, who never existed, nor baby Beatrice Lost, who never grew up, suspended between identities like a trapeze artist who let go of one trapeze but didn't reach the other. The Torres family money is a problem I never imagined having. The weight of unearned privilege. After 5 decades counting pennies, reusing plastic bags, eating eggs when meat was expensive, suddenly I have access to resources that seem infinite like an ocean to someone who only knew a glass of water. Helena opened an account in my real name with an amount I've never seen together. Too many zeros to seem real. It's yours by birthright, she insists when I refuse what seems like luxury charity. It was stolen along with you. But how to spend money I feel I didn't earn with sweat. How to buy luxuries when Donna Celia programmed me for 5 decades, that luxury was waste. That people like us didn't need these things. That rich people were all lazy who didn't know hard work. Class guilt mixes with victim guilt in a paralyzing combination that prevents me from using the card. The unlimited credit card stays in the drawer like a loaded gun I'm afraid to use, untouched while I continue counting coins at the market out of a 5-decade habit that became instinct. Helena desperately wants me to live with her, in the big house with a pool where I was born and stolen half a century ago. Your room is exactly the same, she says as if it were an incentive and not a psychological horror movie. I changed only what was necessary for preservation. The idea of sleeping in a room frozen in time, sanctuary of a baby who never grew up there, decorated for a child who no longer exists, is terrifying beyond words. But hurting her by refusing is also painful. This woman who never did anything but love me from a distance and obsessively search for me deserves better than my constant rejection that I can't avoid. But how to embrace a mother who is a stranger despite DNA? How to call home a house I don't remember, that exists in my memories only as a crime scene? The neutral limbo of the hotel is preferable. Territory without memories where I don't need to be either Mariana or Beatriz. I can be nothing, nobody, suspended between existences. I received a letter from Dona Celia from prison through a lawyer she somehow still maintains. Ordinary brown envelope that trembled in my hands like an emotional letter bomb. I almost didn't open it. Left it on the table for days, like a dead snake that might still have poison, but morbid curiosity overcame justified repulsion. Shaky handwriting of advanced age, uncontrolled emotion, and perhaps initial Parkinson's. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking. But I need you to know before I die because cancer doesn't wait. Every moment of love was genuine within the lie. Paradoxical, I know. I loved you as if you were truly mine. Because to me, you were. You are. You always will be. Even though I had no right. Even though it was a crime. A thief who steals from another thief gets 100 years of forgiveness, they said. I stole you from those who had too much and didn't value it. I became a monster out of love. If that doesn't make sense, it doesn't need to. You just need to know. I cried for hours until dehydrated, not knowing if from anger, sadness, or perverse recognition of truth within the lie. How can love and crime coexist in the same action? How can care be born from initial violence? Helena found me crying on the bathroom floor, clutching the letter like a castaway with wreckage, not knowing whether to comfort me or tear up the paper that violated her by proxy. This is our relationship choreographed awkwardly. She wanting to protect from pain that already happened, me not knowing how to accept protection that comes 5 decades late, both navigating mind-emotional territory where each step might explode. The Torres family lawyer, a 60-year-old man with the face of a well-fed shark, explained the long-term legal implications in a meeting that felt more like a law class. I can sue the state for negligence in not finding me despite resources. I can sue Dona Celia civilly beyond the criminal charges for incalculable moral damages. I can seek reparations that would make me a millionaire regardless of the family fortune that is already more than I can spend. But what price does one put on 50 years of stolen life? How to quantify in currency an existence not lived? What is the market value of a false identity? And mainly, do I want to spend the next years I have left? Because at 52, with health fragile from stress, how many will there be? In courtrooms reliving trauma for financial compensation? I don't need. Helena says it's my sacred and therapeutic right to seek complete justice. Roberto says it's my choice, and he supports any decision. Dr. Letitia says there's no rush and that decisions made in trauma are rarely the best ones. Indecision has become my new normal. Paralysis as Helena hired a retired FBI private detective to discover if Dona Celia had other victims, if I was unique or part of a pattern. The possibility of not being unique, of other Marianas out there living false lives without knowing, simultaneously terrifies and comforts me. The terror of not being special even in my trauma. The relief of perhaps not being alone in this specific nightmare. So far, after months of expensive investigation, nothing has been found. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as Roberto reminds me with scientific precision. Dona Celia worked in dozens of homes before stealing me. How many children did she silently covet? How many rich mothers did she observe having what her barren womb couldn't produce? How many babies did she hold wishing they were hers? Was I chosen for being especially lovable or for being an opportunity that presented itself? Was I special or convenient? The questions multiply like cancer cells, with no answer that cures. I dream of babies constantly now, a recurring nightmare with variations. Always babies being taken from cribs by faceless hands, always crying for mothers who sleep without hearing, always disappearing into darkness that swallows them. I wake up in cold sweat looking for a baby that doesn't exist, that never existed except as myself 50 years ago. Me at 3 months being carried away by Dona Celia, while Helena slept exhausted from a party she shouldn't have gone to. Dr. Letitia says it's my brain trying to process a primitive pre-verbal trauma, creating a visual narrative for an event I don't consciously remember but that my body remembers cellularly. The baby in the dreams is me. Is every child vulnerable to adults? Is Helena's violated motherhood? Is even Dona Celia's distorted desire transformed into a monster? Sometimes I wake up looking for a crib I never had in this room, wanting to save a baby that was already stolen half a century ago. Roberto discovered through obsessively researched medical records that I likely have a younger sister who was born and died after my disappearance. Helena never mentioned it. Pain within pain, trauma upon trauma. She was born fragile, extremely premature. Roberto explained reading medical records he obtained through contacts. 26 weeks. The doctors clearly stated that the stress of your loss affected the pregnancy. Cortisol too high for too long. She lived 2 years with severe respiratory problems. Died of pneumonia that a healthy child would have survived. Another victim of Dona Celia's crime who probably doesn't even know she caused death by butterfly effect. A child I never knew, who existed and died because of my kidnapping, because mother was too shattered to generate healthy life. The macabre accounting of damages keeps growing like compound interest of tragedy. How many lives does a kidnapping destroy? How many generations are affected by a moment's crime? Perhaps it's infinite. Waves in a lake that never completely stop. I decided not to have contact with other biological relatives besides Helena and Roberto for now. Perhaps forever. There are many, too many to process. Uncles who aged looking for their niece. Cousins who grew up hearing about a disappeared cousin like a family horror story. Extended family who wants to meet the lost niece cousin like an emotional circus attraction. But I can't handle being an anthropological curiosity. A morbid attraction at a family reunion. A tragic story everyone wants to hear sordid details of while eating barbecue. What was it like living with the kidnapper? Did she mistreat you? Did you suspect? How did you find out? Questions that cut like a scalpel without anesthesia, each opening a wound I'm trying to suture. Helena understands with pain, but understands. Roberto protects by creating a human barrier. We've created a minimal bubble of the three of us trying to build a nuclear family from radioactive zero. It's sufficient and insufficient like a short blanket, but it's the most I can manage without completely breaking down and ending up hospitalized, which has already been subtly suggested. The money Helena deposits monthly in my bank account under a name I don't recognize accumulates untouched like a benign tumor growing. Statement shows numbers that don't seem real. Many zeros that look like typing errors. I live on psychological disability pension, 3,000 reais that are enough for a modest hotel and simple food. The life I know. Luxury seems like betrayal to Mariana Silva, whom I was for 5 decades. A teacher who reused bread bags, who ate eggs when meat was expensive, who rode crowded buses, who bought clothes at thrift shops. But poverty also seems disrespectful to Beatriz Torres, who should have been, an heiress who would never need to worry about money, who would have studied art or philosophy without thinking about salary. I remain in the unsatisfactory middle ground like lukewarm water, neither poor nor rich, neither Mariana nor Beatriz. Financial limbo that mirrors existential limbo. Roberto says money is just a tool. Use it as you wish or don't use it, without judgment. Helena says it's stolen inheritance being returned, my birthright delayed but valid. Dr. Letitia says relationship with money reflects relationship with identity. That when I know who I am, I'll know what to do with zeros in my account. All analyses probably correct and completely useless because they don't solve the paradox of being two people with opposite relationships with money. I found Dona Celia's diary during forced cleaning of the old apartment that I finally faced with Roberto's help, and 2 glasses of wine for liquid courage. Cheap school notebook hidden among underwear at the bottom of the drawer. Pages yellowed by time detailing the crime, in details the judicial process didn't reveal. Written the year she stole me with firmer handwriting than her current one, detailing meticulous planning that contradicts the impulse version. It wasn't a moment of madness as she suggested at trial to reduce her sentence. It was premeditated for months, calculated like an emotional bank heist, waiting for the perfect opportunity that came at that birthday party. She described her corrosive envy of Helena in sordid detail, anger at social injustice fermenting like sour wine, but primarily the desperate and obsessive desire to be a mother that consumed her like an emotional cancer. Beatrice smiles at me like she never smiles at Helena, who barely looks at her between social commitments. The baby recognizes her true mother, not of blood, but of soul. It's a divine sign that she should be mine, that God is correcting a mistake through me. She wrote in religious delusion that justified the crime as divine mission. Documented madness, registered delusion, crime confessed in pages trembling in my hands. I showed Helena, who cried for 3 consecutive days until dehydration. I showed Dr. Letitia, who filed it to process in future sessions that seem infinite. I didn't show Roberto some burdens a protective brother doesn't need to carry. He carries too much already. The fertility question never consciously occurred to me until Roberto asked during a medical consultation disguised as family lunch if I wanted to have had children, if I'd thought about it. At 52, menopause knocking with hot flashes and irritability. The question is academic like Greek philosophy, but opens a new wound in an already shredded body. I never tried to get pregnant, paralyzing fear of dying and leaving orphans as I thought I was, of repeating the abandonment I thought I'd suffered, of not having family structure for support. Now I know the fear was based on a fundamental lie, that I could have had children with real support network of present grandparents, real uncles, cousins to play with. One more stolen thing from the infinite list. Not just motherhood I chose not to have, but informed choice about motherhood. Helena pathetically offered to talk about surrogacy, adoption of grandchildren, modern alternatives. She at 70, 3 still trying to give me everything, including the impossible. It's absurd to the point of tragic comedy and moving to the point of tears, but too late for this particular dream. Eggs aged with false identity. I visited the school where I taught for 20 years. Attempt at closure that American psychology preaches but closes nothing, just throws everything wide open. Colleagues received me with awkward hugs and performative tears. Former students, now adults, came to speak with me with morbid curiosity disguised as affection. "You were always our favorite teacher," they said in rehearsed chorus. And perhaps it's true because Mariana was a good teacher, dedicated beyond necessary, affectionate with boundaries. This part wasn't a lie. Vocation discovered by chance was real. But how to separate Mariana the teacher from Mariana the kidnapping daughter? Are they the same person or different personalities in the same body? Can I keep the good parts like a transplanted organ and discard the rest like a tumor? The principal offered me symbolic return when I'm ready, knowing I never will be. But I appreciate the kindness of pretending normality is possible, that a teacher can return after discovering her entire life was a lie. I discovered through obsessive investigation that Donna Celia had a sister who died as a child, from a disease that today would be treatable, perhaps explaining her obsession with having specifically a baby girl. Doesn't justify but adds archaeological layer of generational tragedy, trauma creating trauma like malignant DNA. How much unprocessed ancient pain creates new crimes in cascade? How many traumas perpetuate through generations like hereditary curse? Helena lost 2 daughters, one through kidnapping, another through consequence. I grew up without true family, thinking I was an orphan saved from trash. Roberto grew up with shattered parents trying to be enough of a son to compensate for lost daughter. Donna Celia will rot in prison with cancer literally eating her from inside. Cycle of suffering that seems to have neither end nor clearly identifiable beginning. Just victims creating victims in an infinite chain of pain that perhaps began with the first mother who lost her first child. Decision not to have children in my early 20s now seems prophetic, as if an unconscious part of me knew there was a fundamental lie at the foundation of my existence that should not be passed on genetically. Or perhaps it's a later rationalization trying to give mystical meaning to decisions made with false information by a person who didn't legally exist. Roberto has 3 healthy, well-adjusted children. Helena has grandchildren I never met until recently, and who look at me as a curious aberration. Family continues without me, around me, despite me. I am a dry branch on a family tree that insists on sprouting, an end of the line that should never have been cut but was. And now it's too late to generate new branches. Uterus ages along with identity. Eggs don't wait for trauma resolution to die. The 2 women I am constantly fight in my head like an internal court without a judge. Mariana wants Franciscan simplicity, predictable routine, the predictability that 5 decades created. Beatrice wants late adventure, deserved luxury, compensation for a stolen life. Neither can fully exist because the existence of one automatically negates the other, an existential paradox without a Solomonic solution. The theoretical solution would be to create a third, new hybrid one, but that would be admitting that both previous ones have died definitively. And if they died, who is writing this now with trembling hands? Ghost of both in simultaneous possession? Psychological zombie in decomposition? Identity Frankenstein amateurishly stitched from pieces that don't fit together? Roberto showed me digitized home videos of the family before my kidnapping. Technology trying to resurrect the past. Young and beautiful parents like Hollywood actors, happy with a happiness they didn't know was temporary, with chubby and smiling me in their arms. perfect commercial-like life that lasted exactly 3 months and 7 days. It's like watching a movie of strangers who seem strangely familiar, recognizing my face in a baby I don't remember being. Seeing origin without memory. Helena cries every time we watch together, asking for infinite and unnecessary forgiveness for not protecting me from an unpredictable crime. How to forgive what isn't her fault but she feels as such. How to blame a victim for the crime of another she trusted. But she needs my forgiveness to survive psychologically. So I give empty but necessary words. I forgive you, which means nothing but means everything. I constantly think about So Joaquim, the man I called father without ever receiving a complete hug, dead 10 years without knowing I would discover the truth he took to his grave, or knowing and choosing silence as an early tomb. He was a deliberately faded figure, always working double shifts, always too tired to talk, always distant like a star. Now I understand the probable dynamic: guilt of an accomplice even if passive, fear of creating affection with a child he knew was stolen, emotional safe distance for when the truth would appear. How many times did he almost tell in a moment of weakness? How many times did the alcohol he religiously consumed almost loosen his tied tongue? Died of cirrhosis at 60. 2. Drank guilt until his liver gave up in organic protest. Another collateral victim? Or a criminal who escaped earthly justice by dying first? I'll never know. One more question for my collection of unanswered ones. Last session with Dr. Leticia focused on accepting that there will never be complete resolution. That American closure that culture promises but life doesn't deliver. Some wounds never heal, she said with honesty I appreciate. We learn to live with them open, bleeding less with time, but never stopping completely. Your case is too extreme for traditional healing. It's depressing and liberating simultaneously. I don't need to completely heal impossible, just survive daily possible. Helena wants a happy Hollywood movie ending. Family reunited in a Christmas photo. Love conquering everything, including 5 decades of lies. Roberto wants medical stability, a routine that includes our new reality as a new normality. I just want to sleep one night without nightmares about stolen babies, wake up one day without questioning who I am before opening my eyes. Modest goals for a shattered life poorly reconstructed with sharp shards. I write this from my hotel room number 4, packed bags without destination as always. Unused credit card in my wallet like a talisman of an unlived life. 2 identities in my pocket like documented schizophrenia. Old documents of Mariana Silva who shouldn't exist but existed for 5 decades. New documents of Beatriz Torres who I don't know how to be but legally am. Helena called asking about dinner at an Italian restaurant, hopeful voice of a mother wanting normalcy. Roberto sent a message about a medical appointment disguised as brotherly care. Dr. Leticia scheduled a double session for tomorrow, 2 hours of emotional excavation. Life continues demanding participation even when I don't know which character to play in the theater of the absurd that my existence has become. Perhaps one day I'll wake up and simply be, without questioning which version is waking up. Until then, I float between 2 lies. The one I lived for 50 years thinking was truth, and the one I should have lived, but can no longer. Both real in their unrealities, both false in their truths, both me in their impossibilities, neither completely me in their incompleteness. Dona Celia is dying in prison according to the latest news. Terminal cancer that Roberto would diagnose better if he wanted to, but doesn't want to get involved. Metastasis in the liver, lungs, perhaps brain. A matter of weeks or days according to the prison doctor. Part of my fragmented self wants to visit her one last time, forgive or accuse or simply look eye to eye with the woman who raised and destroyed me. Part wants her to die alone as she left me alone in the world without a real identity. Helena says the decision is mine but hopes I won't go. Roberto says medically she could die at any moment. A visit might be a trigger. Dr. Leticia says there is no wrong choice, but there are choices with different consequences. How to choose. Any decision definitively defines who I am. Mariana would forgive because 5 decades of love, even toxic, created a bond. Beatrice wouldn't forgive because crime has no forgiveness. Or would it be the opposite? Impossible mathematics of a heart divided into incompatible fractions. Perhaps I'll visit at the last moment like a dramatic film. Perhaps I won't visit and live with guilt or relief. Perhaps I'll decide at the prison door and turn back. Perhaps she'll die while I'm deciding, sparing me from the choice I don't know how to make. It would fit the pattern. My entire life was decided by others without my knowledge or consent. Why would death be different? At least this time I know there is a choice to make, even if I don't know how to make it. It's microscopic progress, But after half a century of institutionalized lies, microscopic is monumental. Beatrice Torres, Mariana Silva, or whoever I am now in this moment of writing, survives day after day without knowing for what. It's enough for now. It has to be, because it's all I have, all I am, all I know how to be in these two identities that don't reconcile but coexist in internal Cold War. Did you like Mariana's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.